Kids love stories. Stories from books, bedtime stories, stories we make up, stories we tell our children about how they were born, their first steps, what it was like teaching them to ride a bike or learn how to drive, what costumes they wore for Halloween. Stories like this tell us a little bit about our origins, our roots, and our identities. Sometimes the stories are true, or at least mostly true. Other times we embellish these stories for impact. But the stories that are primary in our families and in our nation reveal a lot about us as a people and as individuals. We know that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Jewish families have gathered the first night of Passover for a meal they call the Seder meal. It's one of the longest observed rituals in any religion. And in this ritual, developed by rabbis also hundreds of years ago from the books of the chapters 12 and 13 of Exodus, they recount their freedom from the slavery they experienced in Egypt, and they remember the 10 plagues that are recorded in the book of Exodus. We know that Moses was told that he was called to bring the people out of slavery into freedom. He's to go to the Pharaoh and ask the Pharaoh to let them go. We know the Pharaoh is more than a little resistant. These plagues come upon the Egyptians, and each of those plagues is remembered in one of the rituals at the meal. And we read of the last plague today in Exodus 12, where the firstborn sons were to be killed. But God was going to pass over the Hebrews. If they would kill a lamb, and there were great instructions about how to kill this lamb, it wasn't just to be done something lightly, but they had a certain way to do it, and the blood was to be put over the doorposts and over the lintels so that God would pass over the Hebrew children and save them. If you've ever had the honor of being invited to share in the Seder meal and the recital of this story from Exodus, you know how powerful it is. The symbolism of eating matzah, the unleavened bread, a boiled egg, the symbol of life, parsley dipped in salt water to symbolize the bitterness of slavery, the tears of the oppressed. It's not just a recital of what happened years ago, but in the context of that meal and that ritual, we are reminded of what we are enslaved to today and how we need God to bring us once again into freedom. That ritual, that meal begins with the lighting of candles, and then very early in the ritual, it is the tradition of the youngest child present to ask this question: why is this night different from other nights? And then the story is told. It is an obligation for those families to tell this story in every generation and to make sure that it is passed on from one generation to the next. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes that you will see that 3 times Moses reverted to the same theme: children, education, and distant future. In Exodus 12, verse 26, and when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Sacks makes the case in an article he wrote in the Huffington Post that Moses spoke not as much about freedom in chapter 12, but about education. He fixed his vision not on the immediate, but on the distant future, and not on adults, but on children. In doing so, he was making a fundamental point, so says Sacks. It may be hard to escape from tyranny, but it is harder still to build and sustain a free society. In the long run, there is only one way of doing so. To defend a country, you need an army, but to defend a civilization, you need education. And that is why it's the duty of parents and adults in every generation to educate their children about freedom and why freedom matters. This story has been told for generation after generation during times of peace and prosperity, during times of war. We know that even in those horrible concentration camps during the Second World War, people found ways to recite this story to remind them of God's presence and the opportunities for freedom from oppression. It didn't matter what was going on at the given time. It was their story. It defined their relationship to God. It gave them hope, and is a story that is told still. Freedom begins with what we teach our children. One of our sacred responsibilities as parents and as family and as members of the church is to share our stories of faith. We make that promise at baptism when we promise to grow with a child in the Christian faith, to help that child to be a faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ, to be part of Christ's mission in all the world, and offering the nurture of the Christian church so that those children may affirm their baptism. And so we tell stories of our faith. We tell stories of the creation of the world. We tell stories about how God saved us out of a great flood with Noah and all those animals. We tell the story of the birth of Jesus. We tell the story of his teachings and his healings and miracles, like how he managed to feed 5,000 plus people with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. And we've developed our own rituals in the church to remind us of who we are and where we come from. And so we begin with baptism because we remember that Jesus was baptized and God claimed Jesus as his beloved. And so from the time a child is born and they are baptized, we claim those children too as God's beloved. We rehearse the birth of Jesus at Christmas by reading and retelling that story and all the implications of angels and shepherds and visitors from other lands. We mark off the weeks prior to Christmas during the season of Advent by lighting candles that remind us that God came to us in Jesus to bring peace and hope and joy and love. And we mark the last days of Jesus' life during Holy Week by remembering his Last Supper with his disciples in the upper room, where they were remembering Passover, and by commemorating his death on the cross. These religious rituals have power for us because it doesn't just remind us here and now of who we are, but it connects us with those who have gone before us, and it helps remind us of who we are now and what we need to pass on in the future. These rituals and practices answer the age-old question of why from our children. Why do we come to church? Why do we sing those hymns? Why do we need to study the Bible? Why do we feed the poor? Why do we light candles? Why do we gather at this table and eat those little pieces of bread and drink from those little cups? These are all questions that we answer for our children as we gather and worship and share these stories one with another. Like you, I know that in these days of the pandemic, some of these rituals have taken on new meaning and purpose. Anyone marking the Seder meal or Passover this year couldn't help but think that we were under a new kind of plague. And reading the story of Exodus may have had people scratching their heads saying, oh yeah, this isn't the first time we've survived a plague, and God was with us and we leaned on each other then. In these days of the pandemic, we've discovered that rituals such as celebrating birthdays can be done over Zoom, because the most important aspect of celebrating a birthday isn't eating the cake, but reminding ourselves of why we love that person and why we celebrate their life. We may be eating Thanksgiving dinner via Zoom this year, but there's nothing that prevents us from preparing or eating our favorite foods and sitting at a table and reminding ourselves as we talk to loved ones via Zoom how much we are grateful to be in family together. And maybe you and your family have even developed some new rituals or practices during these days when we're spending so much time together and so much time at home. And how will you remember these days? And what will you tell your children and your grandchildren about 2020? Will we talk about the challenging and scary political environment? Will we talk about what it was like to wear a mask everywhere and wash our hands seemingly 100 times a day? How going out to the grocery store was like packing for a weekend trip as we prepared ourselves with masks and gloves and making sure we had enough to drink and eat so they didn't have to stop so many times? But will we also tell our children that there were some special times, that we had the time to bake bread, and how the stores ran out of flour and yeast because so many people were baking bread at home? Will we tell our children that it was a challenge to do school online and work at home, but that there were these special moments because we were at home that we shared as a family that would have never happened otherwise? Will we tell our children that we discovered that our calendars and our family life prior to the pandemic were so filled, and that wasn't necessarily good for our health or our relationships? Will we tell our children that while we avoided flying, we found ways to enjoy sights around our neighborhood that we didn't even know existed, and we dusted off those bikes from the garage and started riding around? Will we speak of the dedication and commitment of those in the labor force who worked in healthcare and as first responders, who continue to work in our retirement communities caring for our loved ones, who continue to go to work in the grocery stores all of these months and at the drugstores and the restaurants so that we could get our medicine and eat, and those who made countless deliveries to our homes so that we didn't have to go out as much? What will we tell our children? How will we remember these days? And most of all, will we remind our children that we were not alone, that we had community, and that God was with us through it all? Today, we're going to gather at this table where Christians have gathered for hundreds and hundreds of years. We will gather and remember that no matter where we are, eating our bread and drinking from our cup, that we are made one in that community. And Jesus asked us to remember his life and to remember and give thanks for one another and to our God every time we drink. We will drink from our cups of water or juice or wine and remember his life as a blessing to all, and how he died, reminding the people of his day and all of us since that our God comes to us as a God of justice and love and peace. There's a favorite hymn that many of us know by heart. I love to tell the story, and we love to sing I love to tell the story for a reason, because it reminds us that God was with our ancestors long ago, and God is with us today. So we remember in story, in ritual, in song, in worship, who God has been, who God is in our life together, and that God continues to be the God of us and the God of all. Thanks be to God. Amen.